It's time to celebrate. There's a party going on. We're looking at the book of Nahum tonight. And at the end of the book of Nahum, chapter 3, verse 12, we hear that, or read, that all who hear the news are clapping their hands because the enemy that has held people captive, that has exerted extreme cruelty, has finally been defeated. The yoke is broken, the people have been set free. So you can understand why there are balloons going off. It's a time to celebrate. Everything has been restored, things have been put right. But actually, the book of Nahum is fairly uncomfortable reading. It tells the story of the destruction of Assyria, which we date to around 612 BC. So 110 years after Assyria had defeated the northern kingdom Israel, Assyria itself is defeated. And great is its fall. And the book of Nahum doesn't spare any blushes, really, about how God is behind it. It's God's anger and wrath which has been vented out against Assyria. That's the reason why it's fallen, because of the way it's oppressed and put burdens on God's people. The one who has been a force of devastation and desolation now finds itself being devoured by the mighty sovereign power of God Himself. It's pretty uncomfortable reading, to be honest. And we've been here before. It's how the book of Amos starts. There's chapters like this in the middle of Ezekiel, and there are similar chapters there at the end of Jeremiah. And like Nahum, the book of Obadiah is completely this kind of stuff. And it's hard for us to grab a balloon and to celebrate because it all feels too uncomfortable. Here is God pouring out wrath and anger. Okay, it's against injustice, but even so, God, isn't there a better way rather than just avenging injustice and wrongdoing with this kind of mighty force? Where's the kind of reconciliation? Where's the restorative justice that we might expect from a God of love? Well, maybe we're too quick to ask those questions because we're on the side of the superpower. We're more comfortable living in Assyria and Babylon and Persia and Greece and Rome than perhaps we are in some of these nations that are oppressed. Maybe it's hard for us to understand something of this joy and this celebration because we've never known what it's like to have everything that we own taken away from us, everything that we are crushed and oppressed. Imagine if you're in that situation and suddenly that oppressive regime is itself destroyed. Well, surely all of your prayers are answered. And you can understand why people are clapping their hands and celebrating because God is real. He's come to the aid of his people and has turned things back the way they should be. Maybe we're too quick to ask the questions of God rather than to allow ourselves to be immersed in the experience of what it's like to be oppressed and then to be set free. Maybe we're too far down the road of looking for the deep reconciliation and restoration and are missing the events that are being described, that moment of defeat, that moment of things being put right, that moment where the door is opened so a new future is possible. We're already several hundred miles down the road where the events being recorded are right at the start. And of course, this is about Assyria, the major city of which was Nineveh. And so we need to read Nahum and this story of God's judgment and anger being meted out against it, not randomly, but rightly because of all that it's done. We need to read that alongside that book of Jonah and how God longs to see that city repent and come to live under his protection, to live in his ways and to experience and to share not unrighteousness and oppression, but righteousness and goodness. But what Nahum does is records how that way either never happened or was never followed. and instead the way of devastation, of desolation, and of destruction was pursued. And now God intervenes and devours that nation, which has devoured other nations. Uncomfortable reading for sure, but surely we do believe in a God who is supreme over superpowers, whose power is above all earthly powers. Too often, perhaps we think of faith as and our relationship with God as an individual thing or as a small community thing, but God is cosmic. God is above all nations. And so, even if Nahum doesn't give us comfortable questions or easy answers, perhaps it's good for us to be challenged, to be kind of challenged around how big we think God is, how big we think and how real we think his power is against that of even superpowers, the most powerful nations in the world. What Nahum boldly proclaims is that God is slow to anger, but nevertheless real in power. That's how the book starts in verse 3 of chapter 1. The rest is an exploration of those two themes, slow to anger and yet real in power. So as we read, as we scratch our heads and wonder what it's all about, as we hear those difficult questions being asked and coming up from within us, hold together, slow to anger and nevertheless real in power, as we reflect on how big is God and how great is his power, even more powerful than superpowers. And what might that mean? What does it mean for people who are oppressed? What does it mean for people who are privileged and feel that there are no constraints to their power? This God who is slow to anger and yet real in power.